Hello and welcome back to The Pisky Trap, a series where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. Hope everyone's well, and thanks to all of you for continuing to listen and to support the series. It's been a mad couple of weeks here as I've been buried amongst piles of books whilst I've been researching and preparing for the talks this autumn, which will be exploring tales of Cornish smuggling. In fact, bookings are now live for that if you're interested in coming along. I'll be popping links in the show notes below, but I'm going to be at Bude Castle on the 3rd of September, Trelissick on the 14th of October, Cornwall Museum and Art Gallery on the 15th of October, the Poly in Falmouth on the 16th, the Acorn in Penzance on the 22nd, and finally at IntoBodmin on Friday the 24th of October. As I said, I'll pop links below if you'd like more information and to get hold of tickets for those events. If you'd still like to catch the talk on Cornish witchcraft, that's going to be at the Poly in Falmouth on the 8th of August and at the library in Liskeard on the 18th of September. If you're heading to Cornwall Folk Festival this year, then I'll also be there with my talk on Cornish piskies on Friday the 22nd of August, so hopefully see some of you there as well. And finally, if you missed my talk on ghosts and the Cornish landscape last year, I've recorded a version of the talk which is now available to patrons over on Patreon. This is something that I'm aiming to do going forward, is once a series of talks has finished its run at venues, I'll record a version of the talk, so if you're not able to make the venues or the dates here in Cornwall, fear not, I'll be putting versions of them up on the Patreon over the coming months as well. Anyway, that's quite enough of all that. Let's crack on with the episode. Here in Cornwall, we have a rich storytelling heritage and a wealth of myths and legends, some of which are quite famous. The Giant of St. Michael's Mount, for example, or the Mermaid of Zennor. But there are lots of others out there, some of which I often feel don't get the same amount of attention. And in this episode, I want to take a look at some stories that I feel often get overlooked, or at least aren't talked about as much as they could be. And they bring us back to the topic of ghosts. You guys probably know by now how much I'm a fan of a ghost story. And as someone obsessed with folklore, I'm always interested in the themes that sometimes crop up in storytelling traditions too. And in this episode, we're going to be taking a look at 3 stories, all different, associated with certain places and locations here in Cornwall. But all 3 have a similar kind of theme that runs through them, and that is the idea of ghostly or spectral lovers. Love crops up all the time in ghostly tales and stories, sometimes intermingled with the theme of maybe the star-crossed lovers, the Romeo and Juliet type, who defy their family's wishes and vow to be together, meeting their tragic ends. Then we have tales of spurned lovers or unrequited love. Then we have stories where a ghost returns to visit their former lover. In this episode, then, I've chosen 3 ghostly stories that centre around a couple and their relationship in some way. 2 of the stories come from over in West Cornwall, and the other comes from up in the northeast of the county. So then, without any further waffling, here's our next episode, Spectral Lovers. Back in the 1970s, Cornwall-based writer and folklorist Barbara Spooner wrote of how the dead crowded the county, that the lanes were alive with the padding of phantom dogs and the rumbling of spectral coaches. Lights might flicker in the darkness from empty houses, and there was even said to be a woman who stood at the top of Brown Willie, looking off into the distance. But as soon as anyone came near, or moved around from the other side of the tor, the woman would disappear. I think that Spooner was emphasising there that we have a wide range of ghost stories here in Cornwall, and places that are said to be haunted. Whether it's restless spirits up on Bodmin Moor or over at Bodmin Jail, pubs and cottages haunted by smugglers or tales of phantom ships. There's a whole range out there. And I think that one of the reasons they fascinate me is because you can imagine in years gone by these local stories being told by the fireside, perhaps by a relative, or by one of the old travelling droll-tellers, continuing this oral tradition that probably went back centuries. And you can sort of imagine people gathering round and putting in requests, like at an open mic night at a pub. I want to hear the one about the giant near Stithians. No, the one about the witch over at Laddock. No, tell us the one about the old ghost in Jan's Field. That sort of thing. Someone who collected together a number of the old local drolls and legends is someone that regular listeners will be very familiar with by now. And that's William Bottrell. He was born over at St Leven in the far west of Cornwall, possibly in 1812, though the records vary a bit. But throughout the 1870s, he began writing down many of the old local stories that he'd been told when he was younger, and gathered together a lot of the old tales from West Cornwall. Among them is the first story I want to look at, and it's the story of Nancy Trelissick. It's quite a long one, so I've had to edit the odd bits of the story and condense it down. Much of it is lifted directly from Bottrell's book, Traditions and Hearthside Stories, though, and it goes like this. About 2 centuries ago, an old farmer named Hugh Lanyon, his wife and only son, lived on an isolated farm called Bozine, situated on the brow of a hill overlooking the Vale of Penberth. Although they weren't of any great means, they were descended from a well-connected ancient Breton family. The farmer's son, Frank, was handsome and free-spirited. At some point, a young woman named Nancy Trelissick came to live with them at the farm as a servant. The beautiful Nancy was the daughter of a miller and owner of a tenement at Alcea. Nancy, being a distant relation of Frank's mother, was treated more like a daughter by them than a servant. Frank and Nancy spent much time together and soon became close. But both parents initially saw this as more of a close bond like brother and sister. However, there soon came a time, now that Frank was of a suitable age, he was urged by his parents to consider a marriage to a young woman from one of the prominent local families. Perhaps one of the Noys, or the Penders, or maybe the Tresillians, or the Carthews. But Frank would have none of it. He announced, to the astonishment of his parents, that he preferred Nancy to any of them. His father, despite being of reduced circumstances, saw himself as equal to any of the local gentry, and declared that he would rather follow his only son to his grave than see him wedded to the low-born Nancy. And so, poor Nancy was driven out of their house and went back to her parents. The miller welcomed her, glad to see his daughter back. But that evening, when Frank tried to visit her, the miller turned him away. Time and again, the two lovers would try to meet, but their attempts were thwarted by Nancy's father and her older sisters. But her mother, taking pity on the pair, would arrange for them to meet at night in secret. Frank's father found out about this, and his relationship with his son soon soured. Frank would spend a lot of time away from home, riding along the lanes, or at the inn in Bury and Churchtown, returning late at night to avoid his father. He soon fell in with other young men who spent their time, when not working the land, embarking on daring voyages to France to smuggle liquor, silks, lace and salt. Soon, Frank was spending more and more time away at sea, and rather than disapproving, his father encouraged these trips, his hope being that more and more time away from the Trelissics might make him forget about Nancy. Frank and his comrades procured a large decked boat, which would allow for a winter trip across the Channel, much later in the season than their usual vessels would allow. Before setting off, his mother begged him not to risk the hazardous winter voyage, and before leaving, he tried to reconcile with his father, but received only harsh words in return. In the end, Frank swore that no longer would he darken their door, but would make his own way in the world. Before his voyage, Frank met with Nancy in secret near Ulcia, and there, by a babbling brook, they swore their oaths to one another, the heavens bearing witness to their vows of eternal love. Frank placed a ring upon Nancy's finger, and a silver coin was broken in half, with each keeping a severed part. Nancy then accompanied her lover down to the cove at Penberth, where they embraced one last time before he joined his comrades in the boat, and they set sail. After a short time, word soon came from a vessel which had landed at Falmouth that a ship of Barbary pirates had fallen in with the Cornish boat and crew in great distress, and left without provisions, driven far off to sea. Grief-stricken by the likely loss of his son at sea, Frank's father, in an attempt to atone for his treatment of the young couple, begged the Trelissics that Nancy might come again to live with them, but the miller refused his request. Nancy instead went to live with her grandmother, Joanna Pender, the wise woman of Ulcia. She was related to many of the ancient families in the parish, and was known to be deeply skilled in the healing arts, using salves, ointments and lotions prepared from wild herbs. Folk came to her for charms, and for relief from the powers of witchcraft and the evil eye. Anne Joan would tell fortunes, and even cause the small people, the fairy folk, to return the stolen children they had concealed in their fairy homes. It was here, with Joanna, that poor Nancy found refuge, and here, with the sweetest flowers of early summer, she was delivered of a child. Frank's parents again begged her and her child to come and stay with them, but she refused, and when her boy was about 6 months old, she left him in the care of her parents and took work in service to a kind-hearted couple over at Kemuel, who sympathized with her predicament. Scarce a day passed when she did not walk after work all the way to Ulcia to see her child, her sole source of joy in this world. Then one day, around the time she took service with the old couple, a sealed bottle was picked up from the sands at Porthcurno, which was found to contain a paper from many months past, directed to Nancy Trelissick, on which was written the name of the pirate ship, along with the names of Frank Lanyon and his comrades. This message from the ocean confirmed Nancy's belief that her lover was alive, and she would one day see him again. So anxious was she to learn the fate of her sweetheart that she would frequently visit Anne Joan, who would cast her divining spells, and by some mysterious means the wise dame saw that Frank would return, But beyond, there was a cloud they could not penetrate, and a vision, shrouded in the garb of death, always hovering near. This is where the first part of the story ends in William Bottrell's writings. And in the footnotes we're told that just down from the Ulcia Mill, near where Nancy and Frank make their vows to one another in the story, the holy well there was once used for wishing and divining. The practice seems to have involved dropping pins or pebbles into the water there, and the number of bubbles that arose from that would tell the number of years, or in some way answer the question that you'd asked. Anyway, back to the story. So strong was Nancy's desire to know what had become of her lover, that she, in the company of 2 other lovesick local women, decided to perform an incantation to lift the veil from that portion of their destiny, and on All Hallows Eve prepare the spell for the sowing of hemp seed. She and her companions drew their circles separately, but in sight of one another, sowing the magic grains whilst speaking aloud these words: "Hemp seed, I sow thee, hemp seed, grow thee, and he who will my true love be, come after me, and mow thee." Once these words had been spoken 3 times, a thundercloud appeared, obscuring the moon, and a mist descended, rolling in from over the sea. The wind rose to a violent tempest, and the waves seemed to be breaking and surging all around her. The dark clouds overhead became one sheet of flashing flames, and there appeared an apparition of Frank Lanyon, surrounded by surging waves and dripping wet, as if he had been dragged through them. He stood before her, dressed in outlandish clothing, with a long and flowing coal-black beard, glaring down at Nancy with such a look of terrible anger that she screamed. And all at once, the vision disappeared. She returned home, wishing for daylight, and with a sense of dread of some impending evil. Frank's mother, who had a firm faith in the old ways and superstitions, began consulting Joanna herself, who assured her that Frank would one day return to claim Nancy for his bride. But beyond this, all was hidden from view. Some months later, in March, storms came, and one night sounds were heard, as of sailors calling for help, amidst the boom of the breakers and the roaring of the gale. They seemed to proceed from Porthgwan and Cove. Among them, the recognizable voice of Frank Lanyon. He and his comrades had stuck together, had taken the ship from their pirate captors, and had sailed for Cornwall. Anxious to be home, the young men had parted from the ship in a boat and made for Penberth, but in the driving rain had mistaken their position and had been driven onto the rocks at Porthgwan. Ropes were thrown over the cliff, and Frank made sure every one of his comrades was hauled to safety, he himself being the last. From the long struggle in the surf to save his comrades, he barely had any strength left, and it was with much difficulty that they brought him up, laid him down on the grass, battered and bruised, with blood flowing from his mouth. Close to death, he recognized his mother, and begged to be taken home to Beauzine. Knowing he had only a few hours left to live, he asked that Nancy be brought to him without delay, for unless he saw her before he breathed his last, he could not rest in peace. So overwhelmed with grief, his parents thought no more of Frank's request, until they were on their way home from laying him to rest in Buryan churchyard. Only then did they regret not having paid any regard to his final wishes, and no one wanted to be the first to tell Nancy what had happened to Frank. On the night of the funeral, Nancy, who knew nothing of what had befallen her lover, after her employers had gone to bed, as was her custom, whilst closing up for the night, went outside and took a parting look at the sea, glistening in the moonlight, before going to bed herself. She was roused by the tramp of a horse coming down the lane with unusual speed, and went down to see who could be coming by at this time of night, when she saw, approaching near, the horse on which Lanyon often came to meet her in Ulcia lanes. The rider, too, was dressed in the strange garb in which she had seen the apparition of her lover. The horseman hailed her by name, in the sweet tones of her lover's voice, saying, "I am come, my love, to make thee my bride before tomorrow night." He moved closer, and Nancy, spellbound, replied, "Thy lips are icy cold, dear Frank, and thy hand is cold and damp as clay." She clasped his neck and kissed him, and his eyes glared on her like those of a dead corpse, making her blood run cold. Yet she had no power to resist his will when he said, "We have made our vows and sworn to be married, alive or dead. Shrink not from me in fear, sweetheart. Come, mount behind me, and let us away. Ere tomorrow night thou shalt be my bride." Nancy sprang on the horse behind him, and they rode like the wind. All things seemed to spin around them, rocks and hedges flying past, as with fearful speed they shot through the lanes. The horseman spoke not a word, and soon they came to the waters in Trove Bottom, and the horse stopped to drink. In that moment, the moon shining brightly behind them, Nancy saw, reflected in the water, the horseman before her like a corpse arrayed in a shroud. Nancy knew she was carried away by some spirit, yet she had not the power to move or speak. They galloped on until they reached the smith's shop at the end of Burrion Lane. Seeing the light from the forge and the smith was still at work, Nancy, recovering her speech, called out, "Save me! Save me!" The smith ran out with a bar of red-hot iron in his hand, and as they rode past, he caught hold of Nancy by her dress and hauled her off the horse. The spirit also grabbed her dress, and the horse, going like the wind, dragged both Nancy and the smith along with it until they reached the churchyard wall. The smith burned away the part of the dress from the spirit's grasp, at which the spectre, with a wild howl, passed over into the churchyard, where it disappeared at the grave where Frank Lanyon had been buried just a few hours before. Nancy, more dead than alive, fell to the ground. The smith, assisted by some neighbours, carried her to Ulcia, where she was laid on her mother's bed, and she asked to see her boy, who she held in her arms, and requested that he be raised up by Frank's parents, who were there, weeping by her bedside. Above all, she desired that she should be laid to rest alongside her beloved Lanyon. Then she gently sank, and when the morning light shone through the casement, the fair daughter of the miller of Ulcia was seen reposing in her last sleep, her countenance beaming with the same sweet and joyful smile it ever wore when she met her lover in their happiest hours. Ronald M. James, in his book The Folklore of Cornwall, writes that tales of this type were once quite common. He says, and I quote, "In most of Europe, the tale involves a devoted young couple separated by war. The man died, but his betrothed did not receive the news. One night, his ghost visits the woman and invites her to join him on his horse. It is not apparent that he is dead, so she accepts. They charge across the landscape, and near the end of their journey, as dawn approaches, the woman realizes that she is riding with the animated corpse of her lover. In most variants, she escapes, but she often dies shortly afterwards." End quote. He goes on to talk about a variation put together into a poem called Lenore by Gottfried August Burger in 1773, originally in German. It was soon translated into English and became really popular, providing an inspiration for poets of the Romantic era like Coleridge and Wordsworth. Another version of the tale apparently appeared in England entitled The Suffolk Miracle. It was printed as a broadsheet back in the 1680s. There seem to be a number of versions of the tale that appear, particularly here in Cornwall. And Bottrell's story of Nancy Trenawarth, James points out, is quite long and is possibly the most developed version of the legend out there. Bottrell even provides us with a sequel to the story, which I invite you guys to check out, but for the sake of this episode, I'm going to move on and look at a couple of other interesting examples around the idea of spectral lovers. I also recommend checking out Ronald M. James's book, as he's got a whole chapter entitled The Spectral Bridegroom, which delves into this theme in much more detail and gives some other examples. Hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, then don't forget to give us a like and subscribe. Maybe consider leaving a review, which can help other people to discover the series and also helps this project to grow. If you'd like to help support the series further, then please consider checking out my Patreon page at patreon.com/thepiskytrap. This project is completely independent and it's funded by myself, along with the help of listener support. From as little as £1 a month, pledges on Patreon help me to cover the running costs and purchase books, materials, and gain access to historical archives as part of the research for each episode. So if you can help by offering a monthly pledge on Patreon, that'd be amazing. If not, no worries. Just continuing to spread the word among friends and on social media is also a real help. Okay then, that's enough of that. Let's get back to the episode. Our next story comes again from William Bottrell and takes us to Porthgwarra, not far from where Bottrell grew up. It appears in his second volume under the title A Legend of Pargwarra, and he calls the story The Tragedy of Sweet William and Nancy, though most people today will know it as The Lovers of Porthgwarra. The original version's quite long-winded, so I've sort of rewritten this one in my own words. Long ago, a young man named William, the son of a fisherman at Porthgwarra, worked in service to a wealthy local farmer. Soon the young man began courting the farmer's daughter, a young woman named Nancy, and the two of them fell in love. In the summer he would often go away to sea, and when he returned during the winter months, he would come with gifts and regale his master and Nancy with tales of his adventures. Now the old farmer seems to have taken a shine to the young chap, having an almost paternal affection for him. But it never entered his head that Nancy might seriously be interested in William as her lover. Nancy's mother, though, could see exactly what was going on, and she would have none of it. After all, William was simply the son of a fisherman, and not fit to marry her daughter. She said as much to her husband, and eventually she wore him down, convincing him that William shouldn't be allowed at the house anymore. So, the next time the young man returned from sea, he was turned away from the farm. Nancy's father, though, seeing the depth of affection the young couple had for one another, suggested a compromise. If William would agree to go away to sea and and seek his fortune for the period of 3 years. Then upon his return, rich or poor, if the love between the two of them was still that strong, then they could marry. William agreed, and the night before he left, the two lovers met down in the cove, and there they swore their oaths to one another. They split a gold ring in half, each keeping one half for themselves. William then said his farewells and went away to sea. 3 years passed, and by now Nancy's mother was pressing her to forget William and find a more suitable match. With no word from her lover, it's said that Nancy would often go out to the headland and watch the vessels as they came in, hoping to catch sight of her lover. Because of this, the spot on the headland became known as Fair Nancy's Bed. One night, at home, as she lay in bed, she heard a voice calling out to her from beneath her window. Instantly, she recognized it as William's. He was calling out to her, bidding her to follow him down to the cove. Delighted that her lover had finally returned, Nancy replied that she would be down immediately and would come with him. In the room next door, Nancy's aunt overheard the conversation between the couple, and recognizing the young man's voice, she looked out of the window to see him standing there, looking deathly pale and dripping wet. Concerned, she rushed out of the house and followed after them. She tried to catch up with them as they made their way down to the cove, but it proved impossible. They seemed to glide, as if borne by the wind. Eventually, Nancy's aunt made it down to the cove, just in time to catch sight of the couple, making their way out to a boat moored just offshore. She raced down to the beach, but a thick mist soon descended. She called out to them, but heard nothing. A moment later, the mist cleared to reveal the moonlight on the water, but the boat and the lovers had disappeared. The next day, William's father, the fisherman, came to the door of the farm to ask if his son was there, as he swore that William had appeared to him the night before, telling him he had come back for his bride, but was now there to bid him farewell. Thinking he might have been dreaming or it was some kind of an omen, he had come to seek the truth of it. A search party was sent out, but they could find no trace of Nancy or William. But that afternoon, a mariner called to tell the fisherman that he had been the chief officer on his son's ship. The night before, in his eagerness to see his home, he had gone aloft, but as the ship rolled, he fell overboard and was lost. All knew then that William's ghost had taken Nancy to a phantom boat and a watery grave, where they would be reunited once more. In remembrance of this tragic tale, for many years, Porthgwarra was known as Sweetheart's Cove. Bottrell tells us his version of the tale is based on an old copy of verses that he'd had since he was young. He also writes that it reminded the older generation locally of a ballad that they had known when they were younger, called The Strains of Lovely Nancy, which used to be printed in a broadsheet and sung and sold by wandering ballad singers of the West 40 or 50 years earlier, so sometime around the 1820s, which he calls a modernized and imperfect version of a much older story. Ronald M. James talks of an old ballad that would have been printed and circulated at one time called the Yarmouth Tragedy, based around a young woman called Nancy and her lover, variously known as either Jimmy or Jemmy. It was printed and circulated from around the 1720s, so maybe copies of that reached Cornwall. I find it interesting that there are lots of very similar elements in the tale of Porthgwarra to the story that we looked at earlier surrounding Nancy Trenawarth, not least the name of one of the key characters. We've got these two lovers who can't be together because there's a class difference. We've got one lover going away to sea, this ritual of them making their vows to each other and splitting an object in half, a love token, if you like. And William, like Frank in the other story, in his eagerness to return home, tragically falling victim to the sea and meeting his demise. We also have the image of this spectral lover returning to claim his bride and whisking them away so that they can be reunited in death. It makes me wonder whether some of these old drolls drew from various very old stories and legends and myths that have certain key elements in them, which audiences were sure to have been familiar with and enjoyed hearing by the fireside. We're making a bit of a journey way up to the northeast of Cornwall now, to a story that's among my local favourites. Here there's an old tale from an ancient house called Penfound Manor near Poundstock, which tells a tragic story surrounding Kate Penfound. Peter Underwood, in his book Ghosts of Cornwall, writes, Kate was in love with John Trebarfoot of nearby Trebarfoot Manor, but he and his family supported Cromwell, while the Penfounds were royalists. When neither Kate nor John could convince their respective families that love was more important than politics, the young couple decided to elope. One April evening, traditionally the 26th, Kate made her way through the window of her bedroom into the arms of her waiting lover. But Arthur Penfound, Kate's father, suddenly faced the couple in the courtyard, and in the fight that followed, both Kate and John died. Some say that Penfound, in his blind anger, shot both his daughter and her lover. Others say that in attempting to come between John and her father, Kate was shot, and the men fought on and killed each other. On April the 26th, it's said that the spirit of Kate Penfound appears to rejoin her lover in the courtyard. Her pale face has also been seen appearing at the window of her old bedroom. And Underwood goes on to write that a former tenant claimed to have seen the apparition of Kate on several occasions, crossing the hall on her way to the main staircase. Her father, Arthur Penfound, has also reportedly been seen wandering certain rooms of the old house. A common phenomena reported by previous occupants are various sounds. Voices, crashes and bangs are heard from the area around Kate's old bedroom and in the courtyard below, almost as if the tragic centuries-old conflict were being replayed. Some say that Penfound Manor is thought to be the oldest inhabited property in Britain. Built around a central great hall, parts of it date back to the medieval period. And according to friend of the podcast, Elizabeth Dale, it seems to have been occupied before the Norman conquest by Edith of Wessex, the wife of Edward the Confessor, in the first half of the 11th century. It was added to and developed over the centuries. In fact, between 1635 and 45, some of the extensive improvements, including another bedroom, a kitchen and other areas, were either overseen by Arthur Penfound, the man named as the patriarch in the story, or possibly by a Nicholas Penfound. The Association for Cornish Heritage, in an article on the manor's history, relay the same story that we just heard, but in their retelling it's a sword fight that breaks out in the courtyard, which to me makes more sense. And in the ensuing fight, Kate, trying to part the two men, was accidentally stabbed. They also point out that under normal circumstances, a marriage between Kate and John wouldn't have really been a problem. There had been marriages between the Penfounds and Trebarfoots in the past, but with the heightened animosity between the two families during this period of civil war, it just wasn't going to happen. I wanted to look into whether there may have been a real Kate Penfound and John Trebarfoot, or whether there are possible candidates that might have been the inspiration for the story set back in the 1640s. I have to say a huge thank you to Judith Upton, the parish clerk for Poundstock, who did a bit of digging in the local records for me. So let's start with Kate. So far, I haven't been able to find a Catherine Penfound, daughter of an Arthur Penfound, during this period. Part of the issue seems to be that any records prior to 1614 have been lost, and those that we do have from around the time that Kate may have been born have been badly damaged over the centuries. As I mentioned earlier, Kate's father in the story is identified as Arthur. Now, we do know that there was an Arthur Penfound recorded at Poundstock in 1639, and he had a son, also called Arthur, but I haven't found a daughter called Catherine. Some people have put forward the theory that Kate could potentially have been the daughter of a Nicholas Penfound, who was killed at the Battle of Stratton in May of 1643, although I haven't as yet been able to verify that. Judith writes, and I quote, "For Kate to be having an affair with John Trebarfoot in circa 1641, she would have had to be born around 1620, so more likely a sibling of Arthur or maybe a cousin. So this is one possibility, as we know that there was an Arthur Penfound, so perhaps Kate wasn't a daughter, but maybe some other relation. And it's entirely possible that any baptism or burial records for Kate have been lost amongst the records from the Civil War period that were badly damaged. As for the Trebarfoot family of Trebarfoot Manor, which is also near Poundstock, I haven't found a John, though I did find a William Trebarfoot, son of William Trebarfoot, baptised in 1616. It's possible there may have been a John, but maybe again it's been lost over the centuries. Interestingly, the parish register has sections that seem to have been torn out at one point, perhaps deliberately. As Judith points out, if you were a conspiracy theorist, one might think someone was attempting to hide some baptisms and burials, but who knows? What we do know is that the Penfound family were certainly staunch royalists during the Civil War, and according to Elizabeth Dale's research, which I'll pop a link to in the show notes, their royalist allegiances would see them in trouble over the coming years, as in the 18th century they supported the Stuart cause in the Jacobite uprising, and as a result had their lands confiscated by the Crown. As a consequence, unfortunately, the Penfounds are no longer at Penfound Manor. This story around Kate and John is one that's always captured my imagination. This tale of the two lovers from two warring families is something that always draws us in. And personally, part of what draws me in is the image it conjures up of this fight or duel in the courtyard at Penfound Manor. In the other side of what I do, I teach stage fighting to actors and choreograph fights for plays and that sort of thing. So for me, I can quite clearly imagine this desperate encounter between these characters in the confines of this courtyard. And I've always been fascinated by this theory, this idea, that moments like this, of such heightened emotion and intensity, can somehow be replayed hundreds of years later. It ties in with these tales of ghostly sounds of conflict echoing through the house. Since we know that the two families seem to have been on opposite sides during the Civil War, with so many records having been lost, it's hard to say, but it's certainly feasible that there could have been a real Kate and John. Maybe those weren't their real names. But perhaps there were two young lovers who wished to elope, and ultimately met their tragic end because of the animosity between their two houses. Or is this part of a long storytelling tradition? My mind instantly jumps to a famous story, not in Cornwall, but up in Lancashire at Samlesbury Hall. where we find the tale of Lady Dorothy, or Dorothea Southworth, which is also said to date back to the 17th century. In this tale, Dorothy and her family were Catholics, but she fell in love with a young man from a local Protestant family, and so the two could only meet in secret. One night, they decide to escape and elope together, but before the young man can get to Dorothy, her brother attacks him and his accomplices, killing them with his sword. Interestingly, some years ago, skeletons were found buried in shallow graves near the hall, and this has been linked with the murder of Dorothy's lover and his comrades. As for Dorothy herself, it's said that she was sent to a convent abroad, but her ghost has been seen at the hall for many years, and she is known to this day as the White Lady. So there are similar elements here to our story at Poundstock. Perhaps it is part of a storytelling tradition that could go back many centuries. Or perhaps there is a grain of truth there, based around real historical events. Who can say, but it certainly makes for a great story. And I'd be interested to know what you think. Do you reckon it's simply a legend? Or could there be something more to it than that? If you have any thoughts about any of the stories in this episode, then feel free to drop me a line at thepiskytrap@gmail.com or get in touch on Instagram or Facebook. That's it from me for now. Thanks again to Judith Upton for all her help with the research, and to Elizabeth Dale and her brilliant blog article. We'll be back again to explore another local topic very soon. In the meantime, take care and thanks for listening. The Pisky Trap is written and presented by me, Keith Wallace, with music by Elizabeth Westcott and artwork by Caris Harrington.